Alright, so next one is dinosaurs. Let's take a look.
Well, this is boring. Well, hello there. I have some questions.
Well, you've come to the right place.
Excellent.
Excellent.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Gallery. My name is Nuke, and this is Craft of the Cards. This series is fundamentally focused on grading the art of Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, looking at the aesthetics of their art, how it syncs up to the effect, and how it relates to the card's name. We grade the cards out of 10, with 10 being an artistic masterpiece, and 1 being a waste of cardboard and man-hours. This episode this month, however, is a very special one. We will be taking a look at Evols, a very interesting archetype when it comes to their general practice and theme. However, because I know exactly jack and shit about dinosaurs, we have a very special guest, a friend of mine, the guy who created the new thumbnail template we're using. It's Sombraptor, everybody.
Hello there. How's it going, everyone?
General Kenobi. Anyway, so this is going to be a live review, as you can probably tell by the hemming and hawing I have been doing all the time. But it was gonna be a bit of a pain to collectively script a massive episode with the collab, so in the end we're just going to be doing it live style. But we do have a fair amount of notes on the archetype in question, so without further ado, let's dive into the evolutionary soup of humanity and take a look at Evols. Starting off, we do have a couple of notes to take a look at in general when it comes to the common features of the archetype. Mostly, the background for a lot of the cards is the exact same. It's just focused in at different points of the background and pulled out at different zooms, which isn't exactly my favorite thing for an archetype to have. I much prefer it if an archetype does try and create unique ones, but the background in this case actually looks fairly decent. It has this very nice red glow, and it has a bunch of biological things in the background that seem to be showing amino acids of some kind.
A most interesting part of the background is the fact that it contains the March of Progress, also called the Road to Homo sapiens. A pretty famous illustration, just the, transition from early ape to Homo sapiens, which is commonly associated with evolution, which is what the archetype's all about.
Yeah, and beyond that, I have it on good authority from you that there's some obscure fossils in this archetype as a whole, and some very obscure dinosaurs.
Oh yeah, the kudos to Konami for some obscure freaking animals, because these are... wow.
Alright then, so without further ado, let's dive into the first card, Untitled Chapter.
I think it's Jafiro.
Okay then. Well, see, this is why I bring you on. You're the actual expert here. Anyway, Untitled Chapter. The background, as we've mentioned before, is decent, if not a little boring after the billion cards we'll see in the archetype. So, according to you, this is based on a basal lizard of some kind?
So, yes, this is Japhirostegus, a genus of very... how do I put this? It's pretty much on the edge between amphibians and reptiles. So I don't recall if they had started, if they were amniotic yet, so if they had hard-shelled eggs, but they were still considered amphibians to most researchers, even though it's a reptiliomorph.
Okay, so were they spawning like soft-shelled eggs before, or were they giving like weird mammalian live birth?
No, like modern amphibians, most amphibians back then also had soft shells in and laid them in water.
Okay. Beyond that, though, going on to the card art itself, it does have another common feature among the Evol archetype, given its double helix on the tail. This seems to show the power of evolution through the archetype, as it is a common feature throughout all of their cards, and beyond that, very much eventually we get to see the full fruit of it with the evil Soar monsters, which will be coming in the part 2, because this is actually a fairly large archetype and we have a lot to say on them. A nice detail on the cards, I've been told, is the vestigial arms, so apparently that's a fairly good feature to have when we're talking about the dinosaur this is based off of.
Well, this isn't a dinosaur. It's a different type of reptile or amphibian, depending on the scientist you ask. But yes, the fossil seems to indicate that it had some. I'm not sure I'd use the term vestigial, but its arms were less prominent than its legs.
Alright. Beyond that, the effect fits the Evotyl archetype in general, and the archetype's theme as a whole, despite it being very thematic for their upper monsters, may also fit the Fire Salamander legend. I mentioned this back in my Utopics review a bit, but it was thought that salamanders would spawn out of flames because they would lay their eggs in rotting wood, and when someone decided to set fire to it, they'd dash out because their home was suddenly on fire. That seems to fit with this archetype as a whole, though, this constant cycle of renewal. They were a very famous alchemical symbol, and the constant evolution up to a higher point may tie in very well with the overall goal of alchemy, which was to transmute base materials to higher, purer things like gold. Beyond that, it has, like with a lot of monsters, a connection to the future design, especially of the evil Tsar monsters, with the wings. Overall, this card gets a 5 out of 10. It has a lot of nice details. It's a fairly average card, though. It doesn't have anything particularly special with it as a whole, and it does fit very well into the archetype, but it lacks anything truly interesting. Right. Next up, we have Evotyl Pluro, which, from what I can understand, is based off of something called a pleurosaur?
Yep, Pleurosaurus is a diapsid, which is one of the groups of the, what I was mentioning earlier, the amniotes. So an example of a modern-day diapsid are crocodiles.
So, the blue cloud around this card is a bit strange, talking art-wise. I'm not a big fan of the glow in general, but I can see how it works, especially to try and give it distinction from the card around it. The color is actually pretty good on this card. I do like the blues and the kind of pale underbelly along with the orange frills. I think it gives it a lot of color, and apparently a lot of ancient artists tend to overdo it on the greens and browns.
Yes, very much so. This makes it stick out a lot from most what we call paleo art. It's almost become a meme at this point, where greens and browns, while there is a precedent in nature for reptiles of that color, there's a lot more variation than you'd think. So a color scheme like this isn't outlandish.
All right. Beyond that, any other comments you can make on the scientific accuracy of the card? Any traits it seems to share with the actual original pleurosaur?
Well, yeah, the general shape of the body is long. It's pretty accurate. The legs and arms. This weird kind of wingish things coming from the ribs are not correct, but I'm not going to fault a Yu-Gi-Oh card for having exaggerations. Well, it's not even an exaggeration. It's I don't even know, because there's also because I know the wings are a kind of one of the archetype's defining features, but it also seems to have them coming from its arms, so I don't know what the deal is with that.
Well, beyond that, the card in general is pretty decent. It has a good enough design. The background, as we've mentioned, is bog standard, but works well enough. It has some good colors, and the effect works fairly well also, seeming to very thematically special summoning a evil Soar monster, a higher tier monster from your hand when this is destroyed and sent to the graveyard. It's death fueling the genesis of a new group of monsters.
Exactly. And it died out at approximately 150 million years ago, which is also the time that the earliest dinosaurs were coming around.
Huh, that is interesting. In any case, this card gets a 5 out of 10. It is bog average in many ways. Their next card, however, is not bog average, but it's probably on the wrong end of the way you'd want that sentence to end. Evols El Guerrero. My gosh, I hate this little bastard. The color clash is everywhere. It's got a blue glow and a yellow body, and it's just yellow and mottled and looks sickening, especially on that kind of reddish-orange background. It doesn't do enough to really work, and it seems to change up what was normally the pattern for Evil Tiles and a lot of the Evil Soar's eyes, which were this very white and black spiked affair, which actually looked pretty good. Beyond that, I can't really comment on the scientific nature of it, so once again, over to you.
Yeah, so it's based on a creature called the Algenurpeton, which is a stegocephalian. I don't recall if the current literature says that they are amphibians or if they're amphibian relatives, but the general body shape is relatively accurate. I mean, aside from the wings, but you're not going to fault it there. I also find it interesting that they have more wingy things coming from the gills, which is similar to the integument found in some modern day amphibians like axolotls. But other than that, the color scheme, while Nuke isn't a big fan of it, it is pretty standard for early stem tetrapods like this in paleoart. So you can either bump it up or down based on your choosing, on whether you like whether you think it's too cliche or whether you think it's quote-unquote accurate, even though we don't have any evidence to suggest they were like that.
Well, much like the ancient Roman emperor that makes up the latter half of this card's name, this card is getting a thumbs down from me. It is a 3 out of 10. This card looks like ass in my eyes. If they were going to go with a reddish-orange background as the uniform for the archetype, they needed to select a color scheme that would work better with it, that didn't need a sickening blue glow around it, and beyond that, select a color scheme that worked better for the archetype as a whole. I think yellow can work as cards go, but it just does not on this one. It looks sickening and bad.
I ain't gonna argue with you there.
Next up, we have Evols Najasho. I actually do quite like this card. The color scheme works fairly well, and I especially like the purple highlights around the card, and beyond that, the effect works well, and the background, while being bog standard, is still not bad. It's just average. Beyond that...
Well, see, this is a very interesting creature they've chosen, because Najash is is mostly considered to be the earliest snake in the fossil record, so it's what we'd call basal. What's interesting about it is that it still had legs connecting to the pelvic girdle, which it still had at that point. Other than that, the face is very peculiar. I'm not a big fan of the face itself. It's almost got like mammalian dentition and like a face that's almost like goblin-like. I'm not gonna take away points from it for that, because I mean it's Yu-Gi-Oh, but they managed to get its body anatomy pretty well.
Alright, well that's always good to hear, and in the end, this card is actually going to take a 6 out of 10 from me. While it's not exactly the most accurate card around, a lot of the changes do actually make it look quite intimidating. I do like that kind of goblinoid-looking face with the mammalian jaw. It does help to make it look a bit more threatening, and beyond that, it kind of needs all the help it can get with those silly little wings that seem to protrude from it. Next up, we have Evols Odonto, and I am going to pray tell me right now that is not actually how that dinosaur looked.
Well, again, not a dinosaur, but that's actually an early turtle or turtle relative. I don't recall, but its body anatomy is relatively accurate. Sorry to spook you out like that. So yeah, this is a member of Testudinata, or Pantestudines, which, again, the only living members are the turtles and tortoises. I believe it's from China in, looking at Wikipedia, it's Guizhou. I probably butchered the pronunciation.
One thing I'm not a big fan of in this case, though, is it seems to lack some appropriate attack-defense theming. For some reason, Najasho's defense is higher than this one, which really shouldn't be the case, given that this is a turtle, something that really should, in my mind at least, have a higher defense than the bloody snake thing.
It's really peculiar. I'd even suggest maybe switching around the attack and defense points for Odonto with Najasho.
Yeah, no, I can see that making a lot more sense. But beyond that, the card as a whole is fairly interesting. I do like that we can see maybe where a shell will eventually evolve, because from what I understand, the Studenatas were soft-shelled turtle of sorts.
Yes, I don't believe they had fully evolved their shells yet. Odontochelys, or Chelis, Greek. Odontochelys, I believe, was still in the midway point between just hard skin and a true shell.
Huh. Well, that is very interesting. And beyond that, the card as a whole looks fairly good. I like that we can see where the shell will eventually evolve on the bottom, with it seeming to start to segment away, and the color slowly creeping up to the top part. And the dual coloring actually is fairly good. Once again, it shows us where the shell will eventually evolve and cover the rest of it, while the fleshy parts remain uncovered and still vulnerable. In the end, this card does get a 6 out of 10. While it lacks some pretty good attack-defense theming, its relative accuracy to the tortoise predecessor in question means that this card is actually above average. Their next card is Evols Lagosuko, which is actually fairly well done in my opinion. The art for this one does look fairly good. That mottled green and yellow does stand out fairly well from the background, and beyond that, the proportions from what I can gather are fairly accurate.
Yes, aside from the hands, which are oddly exaggerated, it matches its Lagosuchus inspiration pretty damn well.
One thing I'm not such a massive fan of is the tail. It looks weirdly thick in some places. It seems to curl out from around the back of it, but it looks way too big for what it should be, and I'm not even sure if this type of lizard was known for a particularly thick or exaggerated tail.
No, it had a relatively standard tail for this type of archosaur, which is the group that became dinosaurs. Actually, that's an interesting thing. Lagosuchus, it's still a topic of debate to this day, since 1971, which is when it was discovered, whether it is a dinosaur or not, because to the scientists that consider it to be, it would be the earliest dinosaur alongside Marasuchus, which I believe is also a debated synonym of the genus. It's interesting how they chose to give the hands so much emphasis. If anything, if I were designing this card, I would give more emphasis to the legs, because it might be the earliest example of a bipedal archosaur, and again, which is a trait that became quite prevalent among its dinosaurian descendants.
Well, Konami seems to side with the debate that puts this thing directly into the predecessor camp, and, well, to me that's all the confirmation I need. In any case, I'm not such a big fan of this card. While it does have good things going for it, like its active pose compared to the other cards, which I believe seems to indicate that this may have been one of the first warm-blooded animals that existed.
You would be 100% correct on that assumption. Again, like many of the other things we talked about, still a topic of debate. But yes, a lot of people consider this to be one of, if not the, earliest warm-blooded animal.
While it does have that and a good color scheme going for it, its effect is very strange. I'm not too big of a fan of how it seems to interact with the archetype as a whole, and beyond that, some issues with how the card is drawn compared, at least mildly, to its, not alive currently, but formerly alive inspiration, means that this card gets a 4 out of 10. It lacks a lot of the qualities that I think even make it an average card, and in the end is quite disappointing. One of the last Evols monsters is Evols Westlow, which I believe is based off of some form of lizard.
Yeah. Westlothiana is I don't recall if it actually counts as a true reptile, but it's what we call a tetrapod. Reptiles, birds, mammals, and amphibians are all part of the group we call tetrapods, but this is part of the group of tetrapods which would have eventually turned into reptiles. It's a close relative of Cassinaria, which we talked about earlier. But again, this is a relatively obscure genus. So again, kudos to Konami. And then
All right. Well then, this card is actually pretty good as well. I do like the coloration from it. It almost seems to glow with a weird bioluminescence, and the yellow highlight around it, while it does kind of look like a cloud of piss, does help to separate it out from the rest of it. This card is actually pretty good, and it gets a 5 out of 10. It's fairly average across the board and lacks anything really that would make it considered a higher thing in general. The last Evols monster is Evols Casinero. Any ideas onto what this might be based off of?
Well, this is a Cassinaria, which is another type of tetrapod from the Carboniferous.
Card is fairly good. I like how it seems to have this kind of segmented plating on the back, and the artificial spikes, which we can see on there, actually do become fairly prevalent in other cards. The legs that are splayed out at the back are a bit strange, though. Is that a particular feature of the original amniote?
Yeah, it does look kind of peculiar, but it's relatively accurate to the actual animal. At least most depictions of it in paleo art.
Well, the more you know, and the weirder things get, the more likely they turn out to be true, apparently. Beyond that, the effect is fairly interesting and is a very powerful card in some respects. This does help you to get out monsters that will eventually lead to higher order Evols monsters, but beyond that, the card is fairly good and gets a 5 out of 10. It's pretty decent, but lacks anything that could really be considered unique or interesting enough that would get it to a higher grade. The first of the Evil Soar monsters is Evil Soar Diplo, and from what I can tell, you actually do have some issues with how this is portrayed when compared to its Diplodocus counterpart.
Yeah, I don't want to rag on it too much because it's an alright card, but it's just such a generic sauropod, like standard Brontosaurus type thing, which is sad because Diplodocids and the whole family of Diplodocus or Diplodocus, the pronunciation goes back and forth between people, but because the notable thing about them is their absurdly long necks and tails, and here, while they are, pronounced, and again, it's a square-shaped card, or rather, square shape, and I get it that to fit it, but you could there's still ways you could show that sort of absurd exaggeration, because they used their tails as whips. They were capable of breaking the sound barrier. So
that is incredibly terrifying.
Oh yeah.
Beyond that, though, this card is somewhat lackluster. The artificial plates on its back are present throughout some other cards as well, especially some ones earlier in the Evotiles, but these ones look very thick and pronounced, and they don't look like they're following the natural curve of the dinosaur's body, maybe hiding some more hardware underneath. Beyond that, the tail this time as well looks kind of bruised and sickly when compared to the rest of it, which does actually have a fairly nice purple color as the color scheme. The effect as well is actually fairly good and fairly thematic, this seeming to have the neck to reach above your opponent's front row to target their back row. I do like it, but this card gets a 5 out of 10 in the end. It works decently, but lacks anything that could really be considered truly standout. I actually really like the next card in the archetype. It's Evols Soar Palter, which honestly kind of looks like a Pokemon evolution from Gen 5. I can't remember the right way. Can you recall it?
It's Gigalith, I believe you're referring to.
Oh, right, yeah. So the prominent spines on the back do look very indicative of that, especially with their lovely red color, which I really like on the archetype as a whole. It's a bit of a shame that some of the other spines seem almost pinkish in color. It works well with the mottled blue-green color of the rest of the card.
Yeah, I really, really like this card, actually. And which, something that makes me happy, is it's pretty dang accurate to the actual creature, Sarapelta, which is a nodosaurid, which is a subgroup of ankylosaurids, which you may be more familiar with that name. The most notable thing about it was these giant spikes over its shoulders, which are displayed very prominently here, and a little exaggerated, but it's Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm not going to fault it for that.
Yeah, and the card itself looks really good. I especially like the defensively focused nature of the card. I assume that's what the spikes were for in actuality, and it makes a lot of sense that given such prominent spines, it would be a very heavily defensively themed monster.
Yeah, it looks bulky and imposing, like it's supposed to be. It was a relatively large creature, about cow-sized in both like height and weight, but yeah, the face doesn't really match the actual animal, but it's Yu-Gi-Oh! It's supposed to look fierce and whatnot. It's totally fine in my book.
Yeah, well, it does get a 7 out of 10 for me. This card is really good. I do love all of the color they put into the card and the vibrancy of it, and the really interesting design that seems to exaggerate a lot of the features of the original dinosaur. This card does get a 7 out of 10. It is legitimately excellent in many, many different ways. Their next card is somewhat disappointing. It's Evols Soar Volcano, and seems to really be just a fairly mediocre retread of Evols Soar Diplo. It lacks a lot of the character that one had as well, with the nice color. This one seems to favor a more ethereally faded blue, which I'm not such a big fan of, but there are some elements, I believe, which do help it to match the original.
Yeah, I mean, it's all right. The notable thing about Volcanodon is that it was a relatively early sauropod from South Africa. It was an interesting choice on Konami's part to choose this one because it's a relatively ignored genus these days in terms of media, while in the 1950s and whatnot, it was relatively well known. But so well done, Konami, again on bringing more light on this relatively obscure genus these days.
Beyond that, though, there are other elements about the card which I'm not such a big fan of. The wings, while vestigial like in most of the cards, look especially fat and stubby in this one. It doesn't really help to lend to an air of fierceness in any way. The effect as well is somewhat thematic, seeming to explode monsters from your graveyard when this comes out onto the field, being part of an avalanche of rushing magma and monsters which will overrun your opponent. But in the end, it's kind of lackluster. This card gets a 4 out of 10. It honestly is just not that interesting. It lacks a lot of the features that made Diplo interesting, even if that card ended up being thoroughly average. And this one, in the end, it's just not as nice to look at. Evols Soar Sarada is their next card, and looks really, really awesome. The fiery orange of this card, along with the really excellent looking segmented black plates down it, make this card look imposing and terrifying, along with the much more well-developed wings that seem to sprout from this card's back, along with what I have been told are scientifically accurate horns on the front of its head.
Yeah, correct. The position of those horns are 100% correct. Sarada Soros is a really interesting animal. It wasn't the apex predator of its time, because Allosaurus and Saurophaganax / Epanteria / Debate and whatever. In terms of its ecological niche, it might have filled a more leopard-like role compared to the Allosaurus's lion. I really like this card, and no, I don't have any theropod bias. Not at all. No.
You're a scaly. Accept it now.
No.
Alright, in the end though, this card is genuinely excellent. It does get a 7 out of 10. It looks nice, the effect is good, the art looks amazing, and it has a lot of the elements that make this archetype really, really awesome. Their next card is Evols Soar Darwino, and this one is a lot more goofy. It has some of the elements of the archetype that honestly bring it down a bit in my eyes. It lacks a lot of the menace that some other cards have, seeming to put it in favor of exaggerating other elements which don't exactly help it look intimidating. For example, the head seems to be about the size of the rest of the body, and I'm honestly not sure how accurate that is.
I mean, head and neck were basically about the same length as its body, but it's still a bit exaggerated here. In terms of accuracy, the skull's ornamentation is not accurate in the slightest. The Darwinopterus's crest was not like that in the slightest. There were other pterosaurs you could have picked if you wanted to have this kind of devilish plus rhino stuff going on, but that's not the genus to choose.
Alright, beyond that, I doubt it seemed to have any feathering along its wings, even a kind of feathering pattern.
Yeah, the feathers are not correct, which, see, pterosaurs did not have feathers. They had something called pycnofibers, which should be along its body. But, on the wing membranes themselves, that's unlikely, and definitely not what looks to me like stage 3 or 4 feathers coming along the wing membranes. But I will say that they've managed to avoid falling into the trap of the actual design of the wings. They've correctly had the wing membrane connect to the pinky finger alone, as opposed to all the fingers like a bat. That is an abundant error when it comes to pterosaurs like this, and I'm glad that they didn't do that. Though, but then again, when it comes to those needle-like fingernails, that's, well, A, that's not accurate, and I don't think it adds anything to the card itself either.
Alright, beyond that, the card itself is mildly lackluster. It seems to exaggerate things which I'm not really sure should have been exaggerated even for an artistic effect. And the Eva tile monster having levels increased helps at least a bit when it's seeming that this is supposed to kind of beef up some of the smaller monsters in order to help them exceeds into the larger ones. But beyond that, the card lacks a lot of the oomph which I would like to see from it, especially in terms of the design and especially in terms of the art. The effect is fine and the background is decent, but the art itself is just lackluster in a lot of ways. This card gets a 4 out of 10. It's honestly not the greatest in my eyes.
Agreed. Give us a Hatzegopteryx card, huh, Konami?
I have no idea what you're talking about. Anyway, moving on to the next card, Evols Soar Elias. My gosh, if I thought Darwino was bad, this one is 1,000 times worse. The art for this is just so butt ugly. The weird lips that seem to flow like he's spitting at the viewer of the card, his weird stuck-out tongue, and the utterly strange way they decided to jam spikes in all over the body, which I'm not even sure is particularly accurate to the monster, and I don't really care given how ugly this is. The color of the card itself is strange as well, this weird pale yellow color along most of it with the red spine seeming to go over its crest and down its body. However, from what I understand, the fossil itself actually has a lot of interesting history behind it.
Yes, Amphicelius, or Amphicoelius, I'm not certain of the pronunciation, is very, very interesting. It was found during a period in paleontological history called the Bone Wars, which, to sum it up very, very shortly, two paleontologists basically had a big-ass rivalry, hired mercenaries to steal shit from each other, and among them was the supposed largest dinosaur ever found, which is Amphicelius. However, the specimen itself we've only found in a notebook because We have no idea where it is, or if it even existed in the first place.
Well, that's mildly depressing, but that does seem to at least explain the strange decision for the perspective they wanted to put on this card, seeming to try and emphasize its long neck and the massive size of the card in general.
And also, it's clearly influenced by the Jurassic Park depiction of Brachiosaurus. That sort of neck posture would have been completely impossible for a diplodocid like Elias. It's just... oof.
This card gets a 2 out of 10. It is utterly terrible in so many respects, save from a 1 out of 10 by sheer virtue of the effect not being a complete pile of flaming crap. This card looks ugly. I hate the design of it. I hate how it looks at me with its soulless dead eyes. I hate how its lips and tongue seem to be flapping around all over the place, and I hate its weird, terrible idea for a color scheme. Evols Sortarius is the last card we'll be looking at today, and this one looks amazing. It is a proper boss monster for this archetype from the main deck. It looks intimidating. It has well-developed armored wings and a really, really interesting design, along with a really good color scheme that seems to be an evolved form of Ceratos, this time with this kind of mottled green appearance, and the armored segments along its back look just as cool as they did on Cerato. Beyond that, it seems strange, though, that the effect would reduce the attack of this monster when summoned by an Evotal, because surely that's the point of this archetype as a whole, but this card looks too cool to really say anything else about it.
Yeah, see, Epantarius is very interesting, because it may or may not just be a big individual Allosaurus, but if it is its own genus, it would probably be the undisputed apex predator of the Jurassic period. It was just enormous, I believe just exceeding 40 feet long.
My gosh. That is one thick boy. In any case, we were mentioning something early in our discussions about the placement of its hands, though, which I've actually found rather interesting.
Yeah, so I'm not going to fault them for this, but I just wanted to point out that this sort of hand posture would have been impossible for theropods like this. They would have faced each other. They were completely incapable of rotating their wrists like modern birds. So the thing is, this wasn't exceptionally well-known knowledge outside of the paleontological community. So again, especially in 2011, so I'm not going to fault Konami for having the traditional hand posture.
Well, in any case, this card looks utterly amazing. It gets a 7 out of 10, sadly prevented from an 8 out of 10 by sheer virtue of the fact that this card lacks a particularly thematic effect. In fact, it is an effect that actively attacks the theme of the archetype in general, that is, the higher level Evols Soars being summoned by the lower level Evo tiles. Beyond that, though, the archetype in general is fairly interesting to start off with. It has a good amount of theming, and something I forgot to mention earlier that does show up throughout the archetype is the fact that the Evo tiles are reptile monsters, while the Evil Soars turn into dinosaurs, and eventually the Evil Zars, with Dolka, Lagia, and Solda, turning into full-on dragons. It is a very interesting theme for the archetype, and I do actually enjoy it, but this review is long enough, so we are going to be going to a part 2 where we'll be covering the spells and traps along with the extra deck monsters. Thank you all very much for watching. Please remember to subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell to get updates on all my future videos. Please make sure to check out Sombraptor's channel. It will be in the link in the description below. And without further ado, this is Nuke, signing out. Have a good one, ladies and gentlemen.
Adios.